integrated information theory says, in essence, that you need a very special kind of mechanism organized in a special kind of way to generate experience consciousness. Does that fit with what we know about the brain and consciousness, which is where we know the most? And does that explain some of the paradoxes that we have encountered when looking at the brain and consciousness? So one, which is perhaps the easiest to understand, is the contrast between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum in our own brain. That's our brain, so we know a little bit about that. The cortex has around 22 billion neurons. The cerebellum,
that's the surface of the hemispheres.
Yeah. And the cerebellum is smaller. It's in the back here, but it has more than 60 billion neurons, probably, something like that, so more than the cortex. And yet, it is a fact that if you take the cerebellum out of the brain, which is rarely but occasionally done for medical purposes, or in some rare cases, if you're born without a cerebellum, well, you throw it in the surgical wastebasket, so it's gone. This is more than half of the neurons in your brain. Your consciousness doesn't change.
Doesn't change.
Does not change at all, essentially. Yes, there are some things that you don't do as well as before. Of course, you walk differently and so on, but it doesn't change. And if you take away the cerebral cortex, less neurons, you are completely gone. And there's plenty of evidence for that. So what is wrong about the cerebellum and what is right about at least some part of the cerebral cortex? That one doesn't seem to do anything to consciousness, the other one instead is necessary for consciousness. It's not that the cerebellum is made of, second-class neurons. They're not only more numerous, but they have all the right genes and all the right receptors, and it has tons of connection. It has maps of the world in all the sensory modalities, and it controls the output, and it's even heavily connected to cortex. Mm-hmm. So if you just look at it, this is a beautiful paradox. This doesn't do it, this does. They're both neural, they're both fantastically complicated, they do all kind of neural things together. This is really one of those things that should make you think, and you have to have a theory that explains that. Integrated information theory explains that, at least in principle, because it accurately goes back to what we know about the cerebellum, and it shows that that's arranged in a way that's primarily modular. Even if it is very complicated, every little piece of cerebellum does its own thing, takes input, processes them, produces output, in a way that's substantially independent of all the others. This is exactly the way you should not be organized if you want to form a maximally irreducible conceptual structure when you actually see what it does. The cortex, we've known for a long time, is different. It is made of lots of local things that do their specialized things. Some deal with colors and some with shapes, some with motion, some with sound and so on. Every piece of cortex is a different thing. But they also interact in this most intricate way because they are connected in all kinds of manners. So it has sort of the right structure for generating consciousness. The theory clearly explains that that is the right structure and the other one is not. When you lose consciousness, integrated information breaks down. When you regain it, it comes back. In fact, when you dream during sleep, integrated information also comes back, as we showed not long ago. So if one starts for a moment, very briefly, with the theory again, identifying the essential properties, which are that it exists, that it is structured, that it exists in a particular way, that's the information part, that it can be subdivided into pieces, that's the integration part, and it is unique. There is only one that is being had by you right now. And then translate, as the theory does, these axioms into postulates, saying what does the physical stuff out there, what does it have to be like in order to generate experience? And we come to this conclusion that an experience, in essence, is a shape. That's the best way to think about that. It is a shape in this extraordinarily large dimensional space, qualia space, which every state is a possible past entry to a state of a system of mechanisms. And a particular system of mechanisms, if it has the right properties, it will constrain this space in a particular way, in the past, in the future, and that's a shape. Now, it's not like the ordinary shapes all around us, but it's still the best metaphor, because it's going to be this very, very special structure. Technically, it's called a maximally irreducible conceptual structure. Like a shape, it is one, it cannot be broken. A bottle is not a bottle anymore if you break it in two. The same for the shapes of consciousness. But it has an immense number of symmetries that can be broken by this shape itself. Now imagine this shape in some way. Now imagine I have an instrument, which I call a qualioscope, which is something which we can only do for very, very simple systems right now, but it looks at how they are made of physically, It looks how they constrain the past and the future. It looks if they do generate such a shape or not, and in which kind of qualia space, how big it is. So imagine now this instrument called the qualiascope is actually able to be pointed at anything and find out, is there a shape there or not, how big it is, and what kind of shape. So we have this instrument. And now here we are in this jungle, you and I talking. And let's imagine me holding this instrument, which is not impossible to build, and pointing it towards the sky. And when pointed toward the sky, I suspect that while it's vast and great, in terms of qualia, there would be essentially nothing there because it's not able to constrain its past and its future in a maximally irreducible way. So nothing there. You basically don't get any sound, so to speak, from your detector. And then I point it towards the ground, and in the ground there may be a little bit, but not much. It buzzes a little bit. It doesn't detect many shapes at all. Then I point it towards the tree, and suddenly I begin to see some interesting sort of line drawing, so to speak. That's what maybe is what's happening with trees. Then I point it towards you. And when I point it toward, let's say, your liver, although it has a huge number of cells in there, maybe each of them forms a very, very small shape, but there is nothing like one big shape of the liver, nothing like that. And then I point it towards your brain. And even there, if I go back, in the back of your head, well, there is this gigantic cerebellum with 60 billion neurons. I pointed there, well, maybe locally there are little shapes, but there is not a beautiful single shape corresponding to the cerebellum, not much. And I pointed to some parts of your cerebral cortex, and now suddenly there is a big explosion. There is a fantastic, gigantic, immense shape with an immense number of symmetries, which is how, to my qualiascope, your experience looks like. Seen from the outside, but your experience is the shape seen from the inside.
I hear this word is, and when you see that shape, that multi-dimensional shape that has an enormous number of dimensions or symmetries, are you saying that that shape is my feeling of consciousness, my sense, my inner experience, my personal phenomenology, or that is a correlate or relates to it?
No, it is. It is an exact identity.
It is an exact identity.
To be that shape is to have that experience. That can only be had from the inside. You must be that thing. I cannot be you, and you cannot be me.
But you can, in principle, see the shape?
But with a proper instrument,
with the proper instrument,
you could actually describe that shape, because after all, it is a shape, it's a mathematical structure. You can describe it mathematically if you know the mechanisms. But being is not describing. You cannot be what you describe, but you can describe what you are.
Now, it's quite difficult to explain to people how psychedelic drugs work in the brain, and it's hard to try and do that in 18 minutes. So instead, what I'm going to do is show you a few pictures and give you a few analogies to think about. So what we're looking at here are communication pathways in the brain. Each line is a communication pathway between two different regions in the brain. And believe it or not, there's actually an equal number of lines or pathways in each of these two circles, yet they look very different, don't they? Essentially, what we're seeing is the normal brain on the left, where communication is confined to particular communities or cliques in the brain. So, for example, visual regions are talking mostly with other visual regions. This is what happens ordinarily. Then we look at the psychedelic brain on the right. There's much less of this cliquing and much more of an open, freer conversation going on across the brain. Another useful way to think of how psychedelics work in the brain is to think of what it's like to be an infant, experiencing everything as novel, feeling emotionally labile. 1 minute you're laughing and the next you're crying. Having a wildly overactive imagination, being mesmerized by the likes of Iggle Piggle or Macca Pacca. It's no coincidence, therefore, that if you look at how the brain develops as we develop from infancy into adulthood, and you compare that with how the brain changes under a psychedelic, what you see are kind of mirror opposites. So instead of a brain becoming more sophisticated as we develop, more finessed, but also more constrained, you have a brain that is simpler and freer in its functioning. The third useful way to think of how psychedelics work in the brain is to think of the dream state. Here we're looking at the effect of LSD on the brain. And what we're seeing is that much more of the brain contributes to the visual experience under LSD than it does ordinarily. And this effect actually correlated very strongly with the dreamlike visions that people reported under LSD when their eyes were closed. So we could think of both these states, the dream state and the psychedelic state, as conditions where the brain becomes untethered or unanchored from incoming sensory information. And then in this state, it can operate in a more anarchic, freewheeling kind of way, conjuring up imagery from the very depths of the mind and the brain, rather than relying on sensory information coming into the brain. But perhaps the most important thing to have come out of our research with psychedelics isn't a knowledge of how they work in the brain, but rather some idea of how they may be useful or how they can be applied. In this vein, we've recently completed the first phase of the first ever clinical trial, looking at psilocybin, magic mushrooms, as a treatment for major depression.
So just to summarize, we've seen decreased brain blood flow in the major transit hubs of the brain. We've seen decreased integrity in key brain networks with psilocybin. We've seen a marked decreases in the rhythmic structure of cortical activity after psilocybin. We've seen that hyperexcitation in these deep layer pyramidal cells occurs under psilocybin. And we've seen that networks that usually have competitive or oppositional activity behave more like one under the drug. So all these things have led us to make a kind of general theory of how these drugs are working in the brain. And it relates to the idea of entropy or order. And essentially, a lot of work at the moment is talking about there being a sweet spot in brain activity where there's a perfect balance between complete disorder and complete order. And it's at this sweet spot that cognition can be supple enough and flexible enough, but also ordered enough not to be chaotic. We think that there are certain states that exist towards a more chaotic configuration, and that would include REM sleep, also early psychosis, the sensory deprived state, deep meditatory states, the near-death experience, and the psychedelic state. And you'll find that the phenomenology in these states is related. So the next stage to test this theory is to see whether there's a related neurophysiology in the psychedelic state to these different states. Other states which might exist on the other end of the pole would be things such as seizure, where the activity in the brain is hypersynchronous. Sedation, again, even though it's quite a different state, consciousness is lost, but neural activity becomes more synchronous. Deep sleep and depression as well. We think that this might be a overly stable state where a particular brain network may dominate cognition. So this is a kind of metaphor. I've presented quite a lot of difficult stuff, but if you want to take one thing home, it might be that these drugs seem to work in the brain, at least we're making the inference, that these drugs seem to increase the chaotic nature of brain activity. This notion of entropy is particularly interesting because as a measure, it actually is a measure of our uncertainty about a system. So as a system becomes more disordered, it's hard to predict its state at any one time. And we think that this may relate actually to the phenomenology that people experience a kind of uncertainty in their quality of consciousness as the brain networks become more chaotic in their behavior. So I think that's my last slide, and just to thank my boss, David Nutt, and lots of funders and you for your attention. Thanks.
What is a growth mindset? We can liken the theory of growth and fixed mindset to the story of the tortoise and the hare. To have a fixed mindset means to believe one's basic abilities, intelligence and talents are just fixed traits. A growth mindset means that you understand that talents and abilities can be developed through effort, practicing and persistence. People with a fixed mindset often develop and peak before their peers, appearing to be more intelligent and successful than everyone else. However, this is a dangerous trap to fall into. The moment we believe that success is determined by an ingrained level of ability, we will be brittle in the face of adversity. This is what happens to the hare. The tortoise, however, with a growth mindset, continues to power through and work hard, overtaking the hare eventually and winning the race. Nice one, Terry.
Thanks, narrator.
You're welcome, Terry. How many of us think ourselves as not maths people, or creative, or sociable, or athletic? If we are to fulfill our potentials, we have to start thinking differently. We are not chained or bound to our current abilities. Take this tree for example. It needs to be fed with lots of minerals and food for it to grow, just like you do. By continuing to nurture and care for this tree, it can grow taller and stronger than other trees. The trunk and branches will literally explode with growth, just like your brain. Your brain is malleable and physically can change size and grow. Even more so at a young age, the activity and growth of the brain during your short teenage years is phenomenal. So how do you do this? Well, there's no shortcut or secret solution. It's as simple as hard work, commitment and perseverance. In any chosen field or career path, you are certain to have some level of failure at one point. But at each pitfall we come across, you must learn to overcome it. There is a popular movie quote that goes like this: "Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up." Batman wasn't born with any superpowers, abilities or talents, and just as Gotham's Dark Knight understood, he had to train relentlessly to succeed. So must you. Right now these fixed mindset learners might be ahead of others, but they are afraid of failure. And when they reach the peak that they're comfortable with, they'll just stay there. They will never reach their full potential. Failure is the most essential step to success, and as the growth mindset continues to improve, they will overtake the rest. If you feel like you're in a fixed mindset, don't lose hope, because there is a lot we can do to change that. But start by listening to our fixed mindset voice, and when you hear it, talk back with a growth mindset voice. If you hear "I can't do it," add "yet." Fixed mindsets can change. So what mindset are you in?
Mindset was written by Stanford University psychologist Carol Dweck. Her decades of research on achievement and success led her to discover what great parents, teachers, CEOs, and athletes already know: that our mindset is the basis of accomplishment. Lesson 1. The two mindsets. People with the fixed mindset believe intelligence can't be changed. This leads to a desire to look smart, so they avoid challenges. They don't want to look bad if they fail, which holds them back. In the face of obstacles, they get defensive or give up easily. They see effort as pointless and believe that people are only great at things because they were born with special talents. When confronted with constructive criticism, they ignore it. Lastly, they feel threatened by the success of others. People with a fixed mindset achieve much less than they're capable of. On the other hand, people with a growth mindset believe intelligence can be developed. This leads to a desire to learn, so instead of avoiding challenges, they embrace them. They persist in the face of obstacles and see effort as a path to mastery. They accept constructive criticism and use it to their advantage. Lastly, they feel inspired by and learn from the success of others. As a result, they fulfill their ultimate potential. Lesson 2. Mindset in sports. Michael Jordan wasn't a natural. He was one of the hardest working athletes in history. He was rejected by his high school varsity team and the first two NBA teams that could have chosen him. He was devastated, but his mother told him to work hard and discipline himself, and that's exactly what he did. He used to leave the house at 6 in the morning to practice before school. But what about people that seem to just be a natural? Yes, these people exist, but Carol argues that with all the praise for their talents and with how little work they've needed to put in, they can easily develop a fixed mindset. They may not learn how to work hard or cope with setbacks. A growth mindset is what allows athletes to maintain their success in the long term. Carol found that athletes with a growth mindset found success in doing their best in learning and improving, found setbacks motivating, and took charge of the processes that bring success. Lesson 3. Mindset in Business. Jim Collins and his team conducted a 5-year research project with the aim to find out how companies go from good to great. One thing they found was that great companies had leaders with a growth mindset. In the late 1980s, IBM was in trouble. Their culture was filled with people trying to be better than each other. They had a culture of smugness and defending personal status that inhibited learning and growth. In 1993, they asked Lou Gerstner to turn things around. Lou had a growth mindset and encouraged teamwork and got rid of the uptight culture. Over the next 9 years, IBM increased in value by 800%. Ultimately, Carol argues that successful businesses need to train leaders, managers, and employees to have a growth mindset. This can be done by cultivating a growth mindset environment and involves presenting skills as learnable, conveying that the organization values learning and perseverance, not innate talent, giving feedback that promotes learning and future success, and presenting managers as resources for learning.
And if you don't know, now you know.